Welcome to Life Stories, where we bring you powerful, real-life tales that touch the heart and inspire change. Today, we share the story of a man who, after years of neglect and mistakes, embarks on a journey of redemption. With a broken past and a heavy conscience, he seeks to rebuild the relationship with his estranged family. Follow this emotional journey as he faces his past, learns the true value of family, and strives to make amends. Join us as we dive into a story of love, regret, and the hope for a new beginning. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to start today's story. The city stretched beneath an orange sky, the fading light casting long shadows over the neighborhoods that had once thrived. The streets, full of life and noise just hours ago, were now filled with a haunting stillness. I sat in the back of my black sedan, staring out the window at the old apartment complex that had been the home to so many for so long. I had watched it for weeks, observed its crumbling structure, the faded walls and peeling paint. I knew it had to go. The developers were eager. The city council approved the plans. And I was there, as always, making decisions with cold precision. Is everything ready? I asked, my voice firm, trained to maintain control. I adjusted the cuffs of my sharp suit, keeping my eyes fixed on the scene before me, expecting nothing less than perfection. Everything is set, David, my brother Paul replied on the other end of the phone. His tone calm, assured. The last tenants have been relocated. No one should be left inside. The building is completely empty. I let out a sigh of relief. It was a clean operation, the kind I always strived for. Everything had to go smoothly. The plans were perfect, as they always were. But the reality of what I had orchestrated was far from the sterile business decisions I was used to. It was a reality that no one could predict until it was too late. Inside the building, Lily hurried through the corridors. She gripped her baby boy, Jack, close to her chest as they rushed toward the exit. Her daughter, Sophie, followed closely behind. Though the girl didn't fully understand the urgency of their escape, she held her mother's hand tightly, sensing the anxiety in her mother's heart. The walls shook as the workers outside began their preparations for the demolition. And Lily pressed her children closer to her as dust filled the air, making it harder to breathe. Outside, the machines roared to life. And I watched from my car, ever the observer, ever the architect of these decisions. I had built this city, piece by piece, and today was no different. As the workers began their work, I couldn't help but wonder, was everything truly ready? I still see movement, I muttered under my breath, my eyes narrowing as I observed the building from afar. It's just dust, David, Paul reassured me. The job is going as planned. No one is left inside. We've double-checked everything. But what he didn't know, what no one knew, was that in those final moments, as the demolition began, Lily and her children were still inside. They hadn't made it out in time. They were trapped. As the building began to collapse, the first impact reverberated through the ground. I leaned forward, my eyes fixed on the destruction, the dust rising like a storm. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something that no one had prepared for. I adjusted my tie, pushing away the unease that had settled in my chest. The demolition was swift, almost clinical, but in that moment, something inside me faltered. I pushed the thought away. It had to be done. The new buildings would be more profitable, more in line with the city's vision for growth. That was all that mattered, wasn't it? Inside the building, Lily continued to guide Sophie and Jack through the smoke and dust. She could see the exit now, the promise of safety just a few steps away. She handed her son to a stranger on the street, a woman who had been waiting nearby, and told her to hold him for just a moment. She promised she'd be back. But that was the last time anyone saw Lily alive. She turned back, rushing to find a way out. But the building was already collapsing around her. Sophie and Jack would never see her again. The machines outside had already begun their work. And the building crumbled in on itself, taking everything with it. I didn't know any of this yet. All I knew was that we had executed a perfect plan. I didn't understand that in those final moments, lives had been lost, lives that I had unknowingly destroyed. Back in the car, I asked Paul again, my voice tinged with anxiety. Are you sure there's no one left in there? David, I'm sure. The building is empty. Everyone was relocated. The job is done. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was wrong. By the time night fell, the city was bathed in the harsh glow of streetlights. The sound of reporters and ambulances filling the air. The headlines would read that the demolition was a success. The building was gone, and the plans for the new construction could proceed without delay. But in the quiet moments, in the spaces between the noise, the truth began to sink in. The families, the lives that had once occupied that building, were they really all gone? I couldn't help but wonder. In the midst of the chaos, as the media buzzed around, I took a glass of whiskey in my hand, the amber liquid swirling in the glass as I stared at the television screen. The news broadcast showed the destruction, the aftermath of the demolition. But in the pit of my stomach, I felt something unfamiliar, a sense of guilt, perhaps, or maybe something deeper. I couldn't tell. And that was when I heard the words that would change everything. The authorities are still investigating the demolition. Some families may have been left behind. One young mother, Lily, has been confirmed missing, along with her 2 children. The glass slipped from my hand, shattering against the floor. What had I done? The hours that followed felt like a blur. A fog of confusion and guilt that I couldn't shake off. I was numb, unable to process the news that kept echoing in my head. Lily, a mother I had never known, had died in the very building I had demolished. Her children, Sophie and Jack, had become victims of my ambition. No one had checked. No one had asked the questions that should have been asked. I could feel the weight of it all pressing down on me. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to move, to act, to correct the wrongs I had unknowingly set in motion. My mind was a maze of half-formed thoughts and images. But I couldn't seem to make sense of anything. I stared at the screen, watching as the news reporters discussed the disaster with practiced detachment, as if it were just another day in the world of business. Another deal gone wrong. But it was more than that. It was personal. The next morning, I woke to the sound of my phone ringing. My body ached as if I had been carrying a burden far heavier than I could bear. I sat up in bed. The sheets tangled around me like the thoughts swirling in my head. I answered the call before I even looked at the screen, already knowing who it was. David. Paul's voice was calm, steady, as always, but I could hear the edge of worry in his tone. Have you seen the news? I couldn't bring myself to respond immediately. The words stuck in my throat. Yes, I finally said, my voice rough. I've seen it. There are still people missing. One of the families, Lily and her kids. It's not good. David. I gripped the phone tighter, the pressure of my guilt increasing with each word Paul spoke. What happened, Paul? How did this happen? How did we miss them? It's being investigated. You're not to blame for the tragedy. David. It was a tragedy, yes. But, no. There was no, but. There was no excuse for what had happened. The decisions I had made. The steps I had taken. None of it mattered now. The families had lost everything. And I was the one responsible for it. Get it together, David, Paul continued, as though he could hear my thoughts. The demolition went as planned. It's not our fault if there were people left behind. These things happen. I hung up the phone, unable to continue the conversation. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think clearly. The walls of my luxury office, the sleek surfaces and polished chrome, suddenly felt like a prison. I had built my empire on precision, on control. But this wasn't about numbers, about assets or contracts. It was about lives. People's lives. And now I had failed them. A flash of movement caught my eye from the corner of the room. My reflection in the window stared back at me, tired eyes. Stiff posture. The look of a man who had spent too long hiding from the consequences of his actions. In the reflection, I saw something I had never truly acknowledged before. A man who had neglected the human cost of his decisions. Outside, the city hummed with life. A world oblivious to the crisis unfolding just beneath its surface. But to me, it felt like everything had come to a screeching halt. I needed answers. I needed to find out what had happened to those families. To Sophie and Jack. I couldn't undo what had been done. But I could make sure no one else was hurt by my mistakes. I could at least try. I made the decision then. I would find them. I would find Sophie and Jack. I would do whatever it took to make things right. But how? I didn't even know where to start. The orphanage, the shelters, maybe someone there would remember them. Know where they were. I took a deep breath. The weight of responsibility settling heavily on my shoulders. I had spent so many years focusing on success, on business, on the world I had built. But now, for the first time, I realized that the only thing that truly mattered was making amends for the damage I had caused. I wasn't sure if I could ever redeem myself. But I was going to try. For them, for Sophie and Jack. I spent the next few days in a haze, driven by an overwhelming need to make things right. The weight of my guilt was unbearable, gnawing at me constantly, forcing me to confront the consequences of my actions. The idea of making amends seemed almost impossible. How could I fix something so deeply broken? But I knew one thing. I had to try. For Sophie and Jack, for Lily, and for my own conscience. I began my search, reaching out to every contact I had in the city. I started with the shelters, the orphanages, anyone who might have had information on where Sophie and Jack were. My calls were met with indifference or confusion. But I pushed forward. I couldn't stop. I couldn't let them slip through the cracks again. Days passed. Every lead felt like a dead end. The more I searched, the more the weight of my failure became apparent. But there was something else. Something inside me that urged me to keep going. Maybe it was the love for a family I never knew I had. Or maybe it was the hope that redemption, no matter how impossible, was still within my grasp. One afternoon, after a long and fruitless search, I found myself standing in front of a small, weathered orphanage on the outskirts of the city. The building looked old, the windows cracked, and the gates were rusted with age. I had a feeling this was where Sophie and Jack might have ended up, if they were still in the system at all. I walked through the gates and up the narrow path that led to the front door. My heart pounded in my chest as I knocked, the sound of my knuckles against the wood echoing in the stillness. A moment later, a woman with tired eyes opened the door. She studied me for a moment before speaking. "Can I help you?" she asked. Her voice weary but polite. "I'm looking for 2 children, Sophie and Jack. They were brought here after a building collapse," I said, my voice steady despite the tension in my chest. "Do you know where they are?" Her face darkened as I spoke, and I saw a flicker of something, sympathy, maybe, pass over her features. She stepped aside, allowing me to enter. "Come in," she said softly, leading me to a small office at the back. "Sit down." I followed her inside, trying to hide the desperation I felt. The walls were covered with faded posters of children, each one a reminder of lives lost or forgotten. She sat behind the desk and looked at me carefully. "I remember them," she said after a moment. "Sophie and Jack. They were brought here after the demolition. The little boy, Jack, he was in rough shape. Pneumonia. Sophie refused to leave his side. She wouldn't let anyone separate them." I listened, my heart breaking as the woman spoke. Sophie had only been 7 years old. Yet she had already known the weight of responsibility. The duty to protect her brother. I couldn't imagine the trauma she had gone through. But I knew one thing. I had failed them. I had let them down. But now, here was a chance to fix it. A chance to make up for the past. "They're not here anymore," the woman said, breaking my thoughts. Sophie ran away when she found out that Jack was being considered for adoption. She couldn't bear the thought of being separated from him. My mind raced. Sophie, just a child, had run away to protect her brother. I could feel the deep, unspoken pain in her actions. A pain that I had unwittingly inflicted upon them. "I need to find her," I said, my voice urgent. "Where would she go?" The woman paused for a long moment, her eyes distant. Then she spoke again. "She didn't go far. She was found on the streets a few weeks later. I don't know where she is now. But I heard she was seen in the area around 12th Avenue. You should start there." I thanked her, my mind swirling with the revelation. Sophie had been so close. Yet I had been blind to it all. Now, I had a place to start. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep moving forward. I left the orphanage and drove straight to 12th Avenue. My mind focused on one thing, finding Sophie and Jack. I wasn't sure what I would say to her. How I could possibly explain the pain I had caused. But I knew I couldn't stop until I had found them. The streets of 12th Avenue were grim, lined with aging buildings and forgotten corners. The air hung heavy with the weight of 1,000 untold stories. People passed by without a second glance, lost in their own worlds, each one carrying their own burdens. I could feel it, the raw, aching loneliness of the place. It was the kind of street where you could disappear and no one would ever notice. I had a sense that Sophie had come here to disappear, to shield herself from a world that had torn her apart. I parked my car a few blocks away and walked through the streets slowly, scanning every corner, every alley, hoping for some sign that Sophie might still be nearby. My mind raced with questions. Had she been living here all this time? Had she found safety, or was she still struggling? Just like before? I didn't know what I was hoping for, but I knew I couldn't walk away without at least trying to find her. Sophie had been just a child when everything had collapsed, when everything had gone wrong. She had only been 7 years old, yet in her eyes, I could see the weight of someone far older, someone who had witnessed the cruelties of the world far too young. The last time I saw her, she was gripping her mother's hand with such intensity. I had no idea that those innocent hands would end up holding the fragments of a broken life. I wandered down 12th Avenue for what felt like hours, hoping to catch a glimpse of her, but the streets seemed to stretch on endlessly, offering no answers, only more questions. Just as I was beginning to lose hope, I saw her. She was sitting on the steps of an old building, her knees pulled up to her chest, her eyes fixed on the street ahead of her. She looked older now, her face hard and weathered. The weight of years lived on the streets etched into her features. She was no longer the little girl I remembered. She had grown into someone strong, someone who had learned to survive in the world that had abandoned her. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to say, unsure if I was even welcome. But something in me urged me forward. This was the moment I had been searching for. I took a step toward her, and she looked up, her eyes narrowing as if she was trying to make sense of who I was. I stopped a few feet away, not wanting to invade her space. Her gaze was intense, filled with suspicion, but also a flicker of recognition. "You," she said quietly, her voice rough from years of silence. "What do you want?" I swallowed hard, the words catching in my throat. I had rehearsed so many times what I was going to say. But now that I was here, facing her, it all seemed insignificant. I'm David Mitchell. I'm your grandfather." She blinked, and for a moment, I thought I had imagined the brief flicker of shock that crossed her face. But she didn't say anything. Her eyes stayed fixed on me, as if she was waiting for more, waiting for an explanation that would make sense of this moment. "I didn't know about you," I continued, my voice trembling slightly. "I didn't know you were my family until recently. I made mistakes. I made terrible mistakes. And you don't get to just show up and expect forgiveness." Sophie cut me off, her voice hard, her posture tense. She stood up, brushing the dust from her clothes. "You weren't there when I needed you. When my mom needed you. You didn't even know I existed until it was too late." The words stung, more than I expected. I had spent so many years convincing myself that I was in control, that I could make things right. But standing in front of Sophie, I realized how wrong I had been. I could never erase the years of neglect, the pain I had caused. And I couldn't ask her to forgive me. Not yet. Not when she was still holding on to so much pain. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," I said quietly, my voice heavy with regret. I need you to know that I'm here now. And I want to help you. I want to fix what I can." Sophie's eyes softened, but only for a moment. She took a step back, shaking her head. "It's too late for that," she whispered. "You can't fix what's broken." I stood there in the silence, the weight of her words pressing down on me. She was right. I couldn't fix everything. I couldn't erase the past. But I wasn't going to give up. I wasn't going to let them slip away again. "I'm not asking you to trust me," I said, my voice steady now. "But I'm here for you. And I'll do whatever it takes to make sure you and Jack are safe." Sophie looked at me for a long time, her expression unreadable. Finally, she nodded, though it wasn't a promise. It was a glimmer of something, hope. Perhaps. But guarded, fragile, I'll think about it, she said softly, before turning away, walking down the street as if she had never looked back. I watched her disappear into the distance, knowing that this was just the beginning of a long, difficult journey. I had found Sophie, but finding redemption would be a far harder task. I spent the next few days trying to piece together the fragments of a life that had once been mine, but now seemed like a distant memory. I had found Sophie, but it felt like I had uncovered just the tip of an iceberg. And the rest of it, everything that I had neglected, ignored, or failed to understand, was still submerged beneath the surface. I wanted to reach out to her, to make things right, but every time I tried to make contact, she kept her distance, as though the walls she had built around herself were impenetrable. Sophie's refusal to open up wasn't surprising. Yet it hurt more than I could admit. She had lived through hell, lost her mother, and had to grow up far too quickly. I didn't know how to get through to her. I didn't know if I could ever repair the relationship, let alone the trust that had been shattered by my own negligence. Despite the discomfort that gnawed at my conscience, I knew I couldn't give up. Sophie was my granddaughter, and I had a responsibility to protect her and Jack now. I had failed them for years. But the moment I found Sophie again, something inside me shifted. I wasn't just the man who built an empire, I was their family. And I had to prove that to them, no matter how long it took. I went to the orphanage where Sophie and Jack had once stayed, trying to understand more about their past. The director, an elderly woman with kind eyes, remembered the children well. She spoke about how Sophie had fought to stay with her younger brother, not wanting to be separated after everything they had endured. The girl was determined, the director said, her voice tinged with sadness. She never gave up on him. Not for a second. But when we told her Jack was being considered for adoption, she ran away. She couldn't bear the thought of being without him. The woman's words cut through me like a knife. How could I have been so blind? These children had been through unimaginable trauma, and I hadn't been there to help them. I hadn't been there to protect them when they needed it the most. Do you know where she is now? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, but failing. The director sighed. I don't know where Sophie went after she ran away, but I heard she was seen around 12th Avenue. She's been living on the streets for a while. I'm sorry, David. I wish I could tell you more. That was all I had. I had to find Sophie again, and I had to do it quickly before something worse happened. When I arrived back at the street where I'd seen Sophie last, the sun had already begun to set, casting long shadows over the pavement. I parked my car and walked down the familiar path, my heart pounding in my chest. I spotted her again, sitting on the same steps. This time, she wasn't alone. A man sat beside her, his posture relaxed, but his eyes darting nervously when he saw me approach. Sophie looked up at me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes. I told you I didn't want anything from you, Sophie said, her voice hard, though I could see a crack in her exterior. She was trying to remain strong, but I could sense the sadness she carried. I know, I replied softly, but I'm not leaving. I'm not going to stop until you and Jack are safe. She stood up, and for a moment, I thought she was going to walk away. But instead, she looked at me with a mixture of defiance and uncertainty. You don't get to fix things, David, not like this. I'm not asking you to forgive me, I said, stepping closer, but I am asking for a chance to prove that I can help. I'm here now. I don't know how to make up for the past, but I want to try. Sophie's eyes softened, but only slightly. She was still cautious, still unwilling to trust me fully. And I didn't blame her. But there was a change. A subtle shift. She wasn't walking away. I'll think about it, she said quietly, her voice betraying a hint of hesitation. And with that, she turned and walked away, her figure disappearing into the shadows. I stood there for a moment, feeling a mix of frustration and hope. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And for the first time in years, I felt the smallest glimmer of redemption. The days that followed were a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. I had taken the first step, but I still wasn't sure if I was moving in the right direction. Sophie's guarded reaction was hard to swallow, but I understood it. I had been absent from her life for so long. How could I expect her to open up to me? especially after the pain and neglect she had suffered. I knew I couldn't rush this. I had to give her time. Even if it felt like I was running out of it. The weight of the past pressed heavily on my shoulders. And every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the echoes of my mistakes. The sound of a family broken. The lives I had failed to protect. I thought back to the demolition. The cold efficiency with which I had made decisions. And how everything had unraveled because of it. The guilt was a constant companion. One I couldn't escape. But it was also the fuel that drove me to try harder. To be better. I didn't stop my search. Every day, I went back to the streets. Searching for Sophie. I went to the corners of the city where she might be hiding. Places where I never thought I would go. I talked to people who had seen her. Asking questions. Offering help. But no one had any concrete answers. It felt like the world was pushing her farther away from me. And each day without finding her felt like I was failing her all over again. But something unexpected happened one evening. As I was walking down a dimly lit alley, a familiar voice called out from behind me. David. I turned, my heart racing, and saw Sophie standing a few feet away. Her eyes wary but no longer as defensive. She had been avoiding me for days. But now, she was here, standing in front of me. For the first time, I felt a sense of connection. A fragile thread between us that I hadn't realized existed until now. You didn't have to come looking for me, she said, her voice softer than I had ever heard it. But I get it. You're trying, right? I nodded, unsure of how to respond. I didn't have the words to explain the complexity of everything I was feeling. But I knew one thing. I couldn't keep waiting for her to come to me. I had to prove to her, and to myself, that I was capable of making things right. I'm not asking you to trust me, I said quietly, but I want to help. I want you and Jack to be safe. I want to do what I should have done years ago. She looked at me, her gaze still cautious. But there was something different in her eyes now. Something that suggested she was beginning to believe I wasn't just another man making empty promises. I don't know how this works, she said, looking down at the ground. Then back at me. But I'll give you a chance. For Jack's sake. Her words were hesitant, yet they were the first sign of progress. I could feel the weight lifting from my chest. Just a little, and I allowed myself to hope, for the first time in a long while, that things could change. We talked for a while longer. Sophie opening up just a fraction. She spoke about her life on the streets. About the struggles, the loneliness, and the fear she carried for Jack. I listened, trying to understand, trying to absorb her pain without making excuses for my own failures. I can't make the world perfect, I said when we paused for a moment. But I promise I'll do everything I can to make sure you and Jack never have to feel alone again. Sophie didn't respond immediately, but she didn't walk away either. For the first time in years, I had the sense that something was finally starting to fall into place. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep going. Enough to believe that I could make a difference. As time went on, I kept my promise to Sophie. Slowly, with each passing day, she began to trust me a little more. The walls she had built around herself were still thick, but the cracks were becoming more visible. I understood that trust wasn't something I could demand, it was something I had to earn. I made sure that Sophie and Jack had a place to call home, a safe space where they could heal. Where the scars of their past wouldn't follow them around like shadows. In the end, it wasn't the grand gestures that mattered. It wasn't the wealth or the power I had spent my life accumulating. What mattered was the genuine effort. The willingness to show up when it counted. What mattered was family. The realization hit me like a quiet thunderclap. You can't build an empire without knowing what truly matters. Sophie and Jack began to flourish in the stability that we provided. I saw them laugh again. Saw the light return to their eyes. Even if it was only a flicker. But that flicker was enough to remind me that redemption was possible. I had no illusion that the road would be easy. There would be bumps, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But this, being there for them, was a journey worth taking. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more life-changing tales, be sure to subscribe to our channel. New videos filled with powerful lessons are waiting for you. Thank you for being part of this journey with us.